All right, so we're going to do the Monopoly Lab. And last week in Lab 10, we showed how perfect competition, because there's no economic profits in the long run amongst many competing firms supplying a homogeneous good, there's no economic profit. What firms will do is maybe they'll try to monopolize a market. And so the pure competition model gave way to the one price monopoly model. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at that same model, but we're going to look at it with respect to labor and how employees in a labor market with certain skills like basketball players, professional basketball players, they can unionize and keep all other people out of this market. And then because the players union has all the best players, LeBron James and etc. The NBA wants to hire LeBron James. In order to hire LeBron James, it has to hire him through the labor union, which gives the labor union power, right? So we're going to look at how players or employees can collude together to form a union and then sell their labor collectively as a monopoly. Okay, and so here we have the labor demand equation, and this is what if we're using the NBA model, we have a bunch of NBA teams, and they value the very first employee, the LeBron James, they value that person the most, and then they value the person off the bench, the last person off the worst team in the league, they value that person the least. So that's the labor demand equation. The labor supply equation is, each one of these players would be willing to play basketball for different wage rates, right? Maybe the least talented and newest player would be willing to do it for the lowest wage, whereas the one that has a movie career or maybe plays a different professional sport, they have options. They have a lucrative endorsement deal. They're being put in movies, being paid big money. They don't necessarily have to play basketball, so they would require a higher wage. So that's what you can think of this right here, this upper sloping line. That's labor supply. And this is the NBA team's labor demand, right? And this could be in millions of dollars, right? Or it could be automotive mechanics, or it could be automotive assembly factory workers, right? You got demand for them and you got the supply of them, right? So we're going to open up the Desmos model here. I'm going to put it over here on the side. And all we're going to do is we're going to match it to the one we're given to in our version of the problem. So there's my labor demand equation, and here's my labor supply equation. Okay. And I give you the competitive equilibrium. The competitive equilibrium is the quantity here. The quantity here is the number of full-time employees. So the first number is full-time employees, 216. So I have 216 full-time workers here, right? And the second number is the market wage rate, $21.02 per hour, right? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put in here Y equal at wage rate, 21.02. I'm going to change it to a dashed line and black. I'm going to change the thickness to 1. Okay. So this is my market wage right here, right? That's my market wage. It's $21.02 per hour, right? And why I did that is because I wanted to show you what the firm surplus is. The firm surplus, remember, firms are demanding layer. They're like saying, I need your work. I will pay you this much. Help wanted. This is your salary. We need your work. We're demanding your work. The firm's hiring decisions are embedded in the labor demand curve, or modeled by the labor demand curve, right? And they accept applications, right? And so the applicant that is the most sought after is going to have the most impressive resume, references, etc. Right? The least sought after applicant, they're going to have the weakest resume and the weakest set of recommendation letters or job history. They're going to have a spotty job history, for example, right? So all that combined, you don't really want to hire them because you only value them at, say, $8 an hour. Whereas you value this person, the very first person hired, you value that person at almost $50 an hour. Why? Because they have really impressive references, they have an impressive work history, they have impressive credentials, college education, they have impressive skill sets, right? So you basically put your applicants in a queue from the best to worst. So that's the best and that's the worst. On the labor supply curve, the very first worker would be willing to do the job for, it looks like, $3.74 an hour. This person might have like 4 kids, might not have the most impressive resume, and is willing to do the job for very little. Whereas this person out here, they're willing to do the job for $30 an hour, roughly, right? $30 an hour, around $30 an hour. This 330th person, they need $30 an hour to enter this labor market, right? If they don't get roughly $30 an hour, they're not going to enter the labor market, right? Because maybe they have really impressive skill sets, they don't have much kids, maybe they value their leisure a lot, right? And they like to travel, and they don't want to be bogged down, and they have the means, maybe they have an inheritance too, right? So you have to pay this person a lot of money to get them to want to do this full-time job, right? So that's labor demand, this is labor supply, this is labor demand, right? Because this is the labor supply curve, and employees supply their labor. This lower triangle here is the worker surplus. And worker surplus is only 1866, right? Worker surplus is this smaller triangle. I'm going to add that to the larger firm surplus. Firm surplus is larger because they're more insensitive to increases in wages. In other words, they need workers, right? They don't have choices. They can't substitute workers for, it's very difficult for them to substitute AI for the workers or robots for the workers, right? They're more insensitive to an increase in the wages, right? So that makes their supply curve steeper than the employees' supply curve. Oops, sorry. Their demand curve is more inelastic because they're more insensitive to a wage increase than are the employees. Okay, so firm surplus is bigger than worker surplus here. It's got a bigger triangle because the labor supply curve is steeper, more inelastic, generally speaking, than is the supply curve. The total surplus are the two triangles added up together. So the free market, non-government intervention market, the free market maximizes efficiency. It maximizes this total surplus, right? Because it's the sum, and the total surplus is the sum of those two triangles, and it is 4,665. Okay, and notice when I enter the $4,665, the firm surplus plus the worker surplus, it draws the dashed lines in there, right? So the employment level is 216 in my model. The employment employees are all paid the same wage, $21.02 per hour, right? The worker surplus is smaller than the firm surplus. And now, suppose some of these workers don't like making $21.02 an hour, right? If this is an MBA model, maybe this is in millions of dollars, and maybe these stars don't like making $21 million over the course of their career. They want to make $40 million over the course of their career. Well, they can collude, form a union, and working together, they can drive the wage up by limiting the number of people in their union, right? They can limit the number of people and therefore drive the wage up the demand curve, right? Now, if the workers, so the next part of the problem is if the workers in this labor market form a union and your union hires econometricians to estimate firms' demand for workers in this market, the union may be able to monopolize the labor market. In this scenario, since the union's business analytics department has estimated the firm's maximum willingness to pay schedule, that would be the labor demand curve, right? The labor demand curve. This is the firm's maximum willingness to pay schedule. If it restricts employees that can be hired in this labor market, it can push the wage up the firm demand curve, right? The demand for workers, which models the firm's hiring decisions, right? It can drive that wage up. So this labor union is a price maker. The working independently, each employee is a price taker. But when they collude, they can become a price maker, right? So the total revenue of the union, right? Because the union is selling its members labor. This is the price of that labor, and this is the quantity of that labor, right? So the price of that labor times the quantity of that labor, you multiply those together, you get the total revenue of the union. And this right here depends on the number of employees admitted into the union. And so what we're doing is we're replacing W with the right side of the labor demand equation, right? And when we distribute the E here, this is multiplication. When we distribute the E, we end up with 46.94 E minus 0.012 E squared, right? Because we're multiplying this E times that expression, and we're multiplying this E times this number, right? And we get this quadratic equation, right? Okay, so like we did in the previous lab, we can differentiate the union's total revenue equation with respect to E. If you haven't had calculus, it's not a big deal. When you differentiate this with respect to E, first we're going to look at the linear component, and a derivative of a line is just a slope, right? So this right here is linear, and all we have to do is take the slope, which is 46.94, right? So the derivative of a line is just the slope, right? Now we have the quadratic part, right? So the way that this works is we take the old exponent 2 and we multiply that by the old coefficient. So the new coefficient ends up being 0.24. Right? And then we're not done. So when we're differentiating a quadratic function, we have to subtract 1 from the old exponent. The old exponent being 2, we have to subtract 1 from that, we get 1. E raised to the first power is just E, right? So when demand is linear, the marginal revenue of the monopolizing unit or organization, institution, all we do is it's got the same intercept as demand, right? Same intercept as demand, but it's twice as steep. Okay. So you're multiplying 2 times the demand slope coefficient, right? We'll hit enter to see if we got it right, and we did. And notice what happens when I hit enter. Upon entering numbers in here, I get a red marginal revenue equation. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to type. I can't use marginal revenue, so I'll use M marginal. And the slope is 46.94 minus twice the slope of the demand curve, 0.24, and then E. I'm going to edit that line so it looks red. I want to make that one red. Okay. All right. So I've graphed marginal revenue with labor demand or labor supply and labor demand, right? Okay, the union will do what? In the market, in a free market, 216 workers are hired. But what a union does is it limits the number of members in its union to 135, right? So I'm going to type right here, X equal 135. I'm going to edit that so it's a dashed line. And then make it thinner and make it black. Okay. So the union limits the number of workers. Let me just double check here. Yeah. The intersection of the marginal revenue equation and labor supply is 135 workers. And okay, so the union emits 135 workers to raise the collective pay of its members, right? So it only emits 135. Substituting this into the labor demand and supply equation, right? So if I substitute this number into the labor supply equation, I get 1454. That's the lowest wage the new marginal worker will be willing to work for, right? So the 135th member admitted to the union, that 135th worker will do the work for 1454. However, firms are willing to pay that 135th worker, they're willing to pay that worker $135. Or sorry, they're willing to pay that 135th worker $30.74. 30.74 is the value on the demand curve, right? The firm's demand for labor. So if the union only emits 135 workers, the 135th worker will do the job for 1454. The firm will pay up to 30.74 for that 135th worker, right? So what does the union work? The union can negotiate either one of these wages. It's going to push for 30.74. It's going to negotiate a wage of 30.74. Okay. So, and that's because the firms are willing to pay up to 30.74 for that 135th worker, right? If firms hire the union's workers at the union wage, worker surplus will be 29.16 and firm surplus will be 1,094. Okay, so what we have to do here is we have to lift the wage up to 30.74. So I'm going to change this to 30.74. Okay, so what happens is in summary, the union reduces the number of employees available to work in this market by unionizing and only allowing 135 of the 216 workers to unionize. And then it can negotiate with the firms and charge the firms a wage of 30.74, right? So now the firms are paying $30.74. So the firm surplus has shrunk. Is this little triangle between labor demand and this dashed line, which is the union wage, 30.74. That's why the firm surplus is so small. It's only 1,094, right? So 1,094 is the new firm surplus. Worker surplus is above the supply curve to the point where the supply curve meets the marginal revenue of the union, because there's only 135 members admitted, right? So it's the area above this part of the labor supply curve to the union wage. So it's the trapezoid made by these four dots. And notice it is higher than it was. It's $2,916. Right? Oops. I'm going to add that to the firm surplus. Again, firm surplus is the area made by these 3 points up here, right? That's firm surplus. The firms agreed to pay $30.74 per hour to hire those 135 unionized workers. The worker surplus is the area bound by these four dots. And it's bigger than the firm surplus. Worker surplus is much larger than the firm surplus, right? Total surplus is $4,010. It fell. Why? Well, before the unionization, this was the outcome, right? Over $20 an hour and over 200 employees per hour. And total surplus was this big triangle, right? Then unionization comes. Union limits the number of people to 135 in its union, negotiates up to the labor demand curve of the firms, which is a wage above $30 an hour. Firm surplus has decreased to this triangle here, and employee surplus has increased to this trapezoid made by the dashed lines and the labor supply curve up to the dashed line, right? This triangle here is the loss in consumer or worker surplus and firm surplus. And remember, surplus measures the gains in trade for engaging in this voluntary commerce in this particular market. So deadweight loss is the loss in the gains to trade that accrued to the firm and the workers, right? Now, it's pretty easy for players to unionize and become the sole supplier of players to the NBA because the union will include a guy like LeBron James. So LeBron James is in the union. All the best players are in the union. Players not good enough will not be included in the union, right? So if there's like 10 players per team and there's 30 basketball teams, there's like 300 players that are going to be admitted in the union, right? And if the top 300 players are in the union, the NBA doesn't want the other players. It wants the best players, right? So the players have this market power, this collective market power over the owners, right? The owners definitely want to hire from the union because that's where the best players are. But suppose you're grocery workers and you unionize. Well, I could be a grocery worker. LeBron James could be a grocery worker. We could be very good grocery workers, right? Bill Gates could be a grocery worker. People who graduate from college could be a grocery worker, right? If grocery workers unionize, what's going to happen? Well, the firms can get grocery workers who are outside of that union. They could hire new college graduates, so they can hire new high school graduates that aren't in the union. So the union doesn't work in a situation like that. Okay, so a market is said to be a free market if it is free of government intervention. And the example I give here is closed union shop laws. A closed union shop law says employees of business who vote to unionize, that business has to hire the labor from that union, that newly formed union. Now, without any pro-labor laws and regulations, the firms don't have to do that. So they can either hire union workers or they can hire non-union workers. And if the non-union workers are going to work for less money, right? If the non-union workers are going to work for less money, the union workers are going to work for 3074. The non-union workers are going to work for 2102. Well, the firms in such a labor market will opt to hire the people not in the union at $21.02 an hour. And they're going to end up hiring 216 workers, right? If firms are hiring non-union workers and they're hiring 216 of them each at $21.02 an hour, then nobody in the union is going to be hired. Therefore, nobody will be in the union, right? Now, in the presence of a pro-labor regulation like closed union shop laws, the union will negotiate this wage, and because the firm has to hire from the union, no non-union workers will be able to find work at the lower market wage of $21.02. So the union will secure a wage of $30.74, and union will admit, because the union is only going to admit 135 workers out of the 216 that would have been in the market had it been a free market. Now, the labor that firms must hire in this regulated market. Oh, yeah, sorry. So this reduces, let's see. So worker surplus increases, right? So this increases worker surplus because worker surplus was this lower triangle here. And now worker surplus is this larger trapezoid, right? The loss in worker surplus is this little triangle here. But the gain in worker surplus is this bigger rectangle. So worker surplus increases. Firm surplus decreases because firm surplus was this big upper triangle. Now it's this smaller triangle, right? So firm surplus is reduced. Total surplus is reduced by this triangle made by these 3 points. This is the value, this is the gains in trade that are lost due to the monopolization of the labor market by the union. So total surplus is reduced. The decrease in total surplus is called the deadweight loss, which represents a reduction in the value of economic exchanges between marginal workers. We'll go ahead and submit that. Now, why might firms be okay with this monopolization? Let's consider, for example, one big giant firm, and it's competing against a lot of smaller firms. The big giant firm is going to have economies of scale. It's going to be the low cost producer, right? If it's a lowest cost producer, then it can afford to pay these higher wages, right? So its willingness to pay is going to be higher on average than the smaller firms, the smaller high cost firms. So if the monopoly firm, the one big, large, low cost firm, can successfully lobby for closed union shop laws, like in Michigan and other places, New York, if this one large, low cost producer lobbies for closed union shop laws, then workers in a trade can unionize, and the firms have to hire that unionized labor. So what does that do to the low cost producer in a labor market competing with other firms that have higher costs and using labor from the same labor market? Well, it effectively eliminates its competitors. So you can think of this part of the demand curve from this point here to the equilibrium as the highest willingness to pay of the smaller, higher cost employers. They can't afford to pay the union wage. So they either have to like move, or maybe they go out of business. Right. So maybe they move, right? And so it's a way that a low cost producer can eliminate its competitors. And then think about the marginal workers too, right? The marginal workers, um, the marginal workers are eliminated from employment in this labor market. They populate the labor supply curve from the competitive equilibrium to this dashed line on the labor supply curve. In the past, in the United States, unionized workers, unions were unions of white male employees only. If you go back to the 1800s and you look at the cigar boxes, you can see the racism inherent in unionized workers. Only white male workers were allowed to unionize, and the cartoons on these cigar boxes would attack Chinese non-union workers or Black non-union workers. So unions have a inconvenient history in the United States. They were typically, the early unions were typically white workers getting together and excluding people of color or women from being in their union, and then they could get these laws passed that forced firms to hire unionized labor. And the same thing was true in South Africa. In South Africa, the unions were in favor of minimum wage laws. And this is not my research. This is Walter E. Williams's research. He passed away a year or so ago. But he found that the unions were in favor of minimum wage laws. Why? Because maybe racist firms owned by racist white people in South Africa, in the absence of a minimum wage law, they were wanting to hire non-unionized Black workers at the lower competitive wage than the labor that they preferred, the white-only unions, at the union wage. So the labor union supporting a minimum wage law, they could push the wages of non-union laborers up with a minimum wage law, not equal to the union, but maybe just below the union wage. And by doing that, they make the cost of discriminating much, much, much less. And so the discriminatory firms end up hiring the white-only labor in the labor union. So it's really important to understand the marginal firms and the marginal consumers of that are affected by policy and monopolization and whatnot.